Hi, this video is to let you know that the most important climate science statement ever made, you almost certainly have never heard about. And so this is the overlooked immediacy of climate change mitigation. I'm Peter Carter. The IPCC has shown us that for many, many years, global emissions had to be in decline by 2020. This video communicates this history to you. And so, to these most important scientific statements. This is the first of two of them from the IPCC Chair H. He made this one at the opening of the United Nations COP 25, the 25th Conference of the Parties to the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And his statement was made at the opening plenary, the big opening with everybody in attendance of this Madrid COP, in December of 2019. So here's excerpts from the statement from the IPCC chair. It is a powerful statement. He said, "Let me start by reminding you that our assessments show that climate stabilization implies that greenhouse gas emissions must start to peak from next year. But emissions are continuing to increase with no sign of peaking soon. Our three special reports on warming of 1.5 degrees C, that was the big 2018 report, the report on climate change and land in 2019, and the report on the ocean and cryosphere also in 2019 in a changing climate, indicate that the impacts of current warming are much more severe than previously understood. The three special reports reconfirm the urgent need for immediate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions." Of course, I've highlighted the immediate reductions, and Dr. Lee repeated this. Such immediate reductions, he said, would provide the world with more space for cost-effective and sustainable mitigation and adaptation options. Immediate reductions would generate opportunities for investment in innovation and technologies for higher productivity in energy and resource use, in alternative technologies for a world free of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to repeat that. A world free of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and for investment in know-how for achieving equitable transitions. And then Dr. Lee goes on to quote the Executive Secretary of the UN Climate Department, who had previously done her opening statement. As Executive Secretary Espinosa has said, "If we stay on our current path, we risk a sharp rise in global temperatures this century," and I quote what she said. "This will have enormous negative consequences for humanity and threaten our existence on this planet." I will repeat that. Threaten our existence on this planet. We need an immediate and urgent change in trajectory. Meeting it is absolutely necessary to the health, safety, and security of everyone on this planet, both in the short and the long term. Dr. Lee said, "The IPCC findings support your conclusions." He went on, "Later this week, we will be discussing our two latest special reports at IPCC special events at the COP 25 in Madrid. Both point to the need for immediate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if we are to stabilize the climate." So how could the chair of the IPCC be more definite than that in 2019? Repeating over and over the imperative of immediacy in mitigation of global climate change. However, I couldn't find it anywhere in the media, and I subsequently couldn't find it, nor did I hear it from anywhere else. So I go to the next and previous United Nations Conference of the Parties, the COP 26 in Glasgow in October of last year, 2021, and this is an excerpt of the IPCC Chair H. Lee's presentation, his statement at that opening plenary. "Science shows that changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and becoming more intense, and affecting every part of the world. It is now unequivocal that human influence is causing climate change, making extreme events more frequent and more severe. And you remember that was repeated in the IPCC's sixth assessment that came out subsequent to this COP. Global warming of 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C will be exceeded during this century unless immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions occur. So in 2018, the chair of the IPCC said that 1.5 degrees C would be out of reach without immediate global emissions reduction. And in 2021, last year, he made the statement that this applied also to 2 degrees C. Now, this is nothing new, as I'll be showing you from a variety of scientific and IPCC sources. There's nothing new that global warming of 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C required to have been in decline by, in fact, 2020. The immediate global emissions decline, which was stated and stressed in no uncertain terms by the chair of the IPCC in 2019 and in 2021, both were never reported, never mentioned, and I couldn't find either of these statements from the IPCC chair, Dr. Lee, with a search on the internet. So we start with the current IPCC 6 assessment, and this shows the best case scenarios. This one is the 1.5 degrees C limit, and this one in deeper blue is the 2 degrees C limit. These are both limits by 2100, and they both assume successful removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, so-called negative emissions. Both of them start to decline from 2020. This is from the AR6, a much more complicated projection with many different scenarios, but showing the same thing, that to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C by 2100, global emissions decline from 2020. This is the latest assessment of the combined national emissions targets by the UN Climate Change Secretariat. It was published 17th of September 2021. The projections run to 2060 with respect to where we have to be going, and the projection of the national emissions targets combined is this red range here, projected up to 2030. Under the Paris Agreement, the countries report their proposed, supposedly planned, national emissions targets up to 2030. The Secretariat further projects that to fit with the scenario called SSP2 4.5, and that scenario reaches 3.3 degrees C by 2100. However, what I'm interested in for this video is when the science has global emissions switched to decline. And again, this is very clear in this report from the Secretariat. It's very clear that for all projections, global emissions decline 2020. This one is below 2 degrees C. This is 1.5 degrees C with limited overshoot, which is just above 1.5 degrees C. And this one here, which is what we need to be on, is the 1.5 degrees C limit. And they all decline from 2020. Now this is particularly important. This is coal. This is a projection for mitigation with respect to coal, which was published in 2020. And as you can see, emissions of coal have to decline immediately, and decline very rapidly. Most people probably won't be aware that there was something new in the IPCC 1.5 degrees C report with respect to mitigation, and an essential first for the IPCC. It provided not only the percentage reduction in emissions by 2030 and by 2050 for a chance at the 1.5 degrees C limit, but also it provided specific percentages of energy required for 2030 and 2050, and in the case of fossil fuels, of course, that meant a reduction in energy. So there's the comprehensive list there, and this I'm showing you is the reduction in coal production, the change of primary energy from coal. And in 2030 that had to decline by 78%, and by 2050 coal had to decline 97%. So what the IPCC is saying here is that coal energy has to end, and it has to end fast. This is from the AR6. This is a graph, a projection that the media called very appropriately, it's now or never. So this goes up to 2050. This is the 2 degrees C limit projection, the projection for 2 degrees C by 2100, that is, and this one in blue is the 1.5 degrees C limit. Global emissions have to decline immediately. They had to decline from 2020. This was particularly useful from the AR6, the Working Group 3, which showed the IPCC estimate of where we are going with current implemented policies, and it leads us to 3.2 degrees C by 2100. This is called the production gap. It's a very, very useful projection which was just introduced a few years ago by UNEP along with several other organizations. And the production gap tells us about fossil fuel. So this is fossil fuel production that we're looking at here. These projections are what the world is planning on, and here we have fossil fuel production for a 2 degree C limit by 2100 and fossil fuel production for a 1.5 degree C limit. So again, fossil fuel production has to go into a rapid decline from 2020. So here is the IPCC 2018 1.5 degrees C report, and in the best case emissions scenario, emissions of CO2 go into decline from 2020. And these are the numbers there and there for the required percentage decline from 2010 to 2030 and to 2050. This is from UNEP. UNEP produces annual, been doing this for many years, annual gap reports. This is the very best source of information for understanding and for policy making, both on what has to happen with respect to emissions and also to where the world is headed with respect to emissions. So I'm just going to show the UNEP take on where emissions have to go for 1.5 degrees C and for 2 degrees C. This is the 2019 UNEP gap report. It's a famous report because the UNEP worked out that emissions have to be cut 7.6% per year if emissions had gone into decline, as indeed they had to, by 2020. So here's the text from that: 7.6% per year on average for the 1.5 degree C goal, and greater cuts than that even will be required the longer that action is delayed. This is also from UNEP 2019. This was particularly interesting because it was a report of a decade past UNEP assessments, and they included in this the UNEP gap report of 2011. And in 2011, global emissions both for 2 degrees C in the gray and for 1.5 degrees C in the cream color decline before 2020. And in fact, this is the text from UNEP, which said emissions peak before 2020 with a rapid decline afterwards. So this shows the projection up to 2100. This is from Climate Action Tracker, their December 2018 update. The Climate Action Tracker is a very, very useful site which is managed by climate change experts, and again, Tracker follows where the world is headed, but again, I'm just looking at Climate Action Tracker's take on the 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C limit. It is also for greenhouse gas emissions, for CO2 equivalent, and as you see here, for the 2 degree C compliant projection and the 1.5 degree C compliant projection, emissions decline 2020. This is a good graphic from the BBC, October of 2021, This is published with respect to the upcoming COP26 United Nations Climate Conference, and this showed that for 1.5 degrees C, global CO2 equivalent emissions decline from 2020, as you can see there. This is from the International Energy Agency. I call the IEA the organization which was set up to keep the oil flowing around the world. However, it's actually one of the best sources, projections, and where the world is headed without prompt and proper mitigation. This can be found in the annual IEA World Energy Outlooks, and because it's IEA, this is fossil fuel CO2 emissions. So this one was published in 2011, and this shows global emissions going into decline from 2016 there, certainly before 2020. This part of the projection made the headlines. At that time, IEA estimated that the current policies had the world headed for a 6 degrees C temperature increase by 2100. This is another one from the IEA World Energy Outlook of 2016. The 2 degrees C scenario shows that emissions have to decline around 2016 again, and the IEA, as it does on a regular basis, pointed out that current national emissions targets or current pledges fall short of limiting to an increase of 2 degrees C. We're now leading up to the IPCC's 2014 fifth assessment, the RCP scenarios as they were called, and we'll be looking at the best case RCP 2.6 scenario. This actually was published in 2011 by Van Vuren, and this was the reference for the IPCC's 2014 fifth assessment. So you can see the best case scenario, RCP 2.6, stands out rather well for us in this publication, and there I've made it even more obvious that in this case carbon emissions in gigatons of carbon declines 2020. So this is that best case scenario in the IPCC assessment. Actually, this is from a presentation that was given by one of the lead authors of the IPCC fifth assessment. The purpose was to show 2 degrees C as well as 3 degrees C, but I'm just showing the projection for the 2 degrees C limit, or under 2 degrees C as the best case scenario actually is. And as you can see, emissions go into decline from 2020. And again, this scenario is for annual greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 equivalent. As you can see, we have negative emissions, and the temperature increase of RCP 2.6 by 2100 was 1.6 degrees C. So this was well below 2 degrees C, but that's only 2 degrees C by 2100. This is a particularly clear image of RCP 2.6, and this is fossil fuel CO2 emissions, and it shows that fossil fuel CO2 emissions go into decline by 2020, and there's negative emissions on fossil fuels after 2070. When I say negative emissions, this is assumed to be successful CO2 removal from the atmosphere. Negative emissions CO2 removal has been a topic in climate science for many years. Here we are at 2022, and there's nothing happening with regards to removing CO2 at scale. The current and most recent IPCC mitigation projections rely heavily on this assumed successful CO2 removal. Going further back in time again, we get to the IPCC's fourth assessment in 2007. And the best case scenario is called Category 1 in this assessment, and it's the best case for the 2 degrees C equilibrium limit, long-term equilibrium limit, long after 2100. And this shows that CO2 emissions decline by 2015, and they go negative after 2080. So actually negative emissions goes back a long way. The numbers, the data for this is 445 ppm CO2 equivalent, or 350 ppm CO2, and radiative forcing of 2.5 watts per square meter. Now that the record of the science, multiple publications, multiple statements over multiple years, shows that we definitely have to put global emissions into decline immediately. Of course, the question is, how on earth do we get global emissions to decline on an immediate basis? Fossil fuel subsidies. What you're seeing here, the image, which is quite similar to all the other ones I've shown for the 2 degrees C limit and 1.5 degrees C limit CO2 decline, this is from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, of September 2021, their most recent publication over fossil fuel subsidies, in which they find that those subsidies amount to trillions of dollars a year. Therefore, immediate government action can readily put emissions into decline immediately and rapidly. To do that, as everybody has advised for years and years and years, governments have to terminate all fossil fuel subsidies unconditionally. No loopholes. This is the projection from the IMF, with no fossil fuel subsidies shown in the blue dashed line there. And as you see, CO2 emissions goes into decline on an immediate basis and rapidly. It switches us from a situation in which we are looking at a temperature increase of over 3 degrees C. It puts us into a situation of emissions declining in line with a course of holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial. To capture the full amount, many trillions of dollars of fossil fuel subsidies, the fossil fuel corporations have to be charged the full cost of their deadly pollution. I'm finishing the video on the statement by the IPCC Chair H Lee at the Glasgow United Nations Climate Conference, October 2021. And he said global warming of 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C will be exceeded during this century unless immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions occur. So I would ask you to get to work on the communicating that for some extraordinary reason has not been done. Nobody is aware of this statement that the IPCC chair has made. So please, you could go to work and communicate this to as many people as you possibly can. Also, get to work to compel our governments to stop fossil fuel subsidies. This is a most unbelievable, terrible crime. If we are to survive, our governments must stop enabling the fossil fuel industry to carry on extracting fossil fuels, burning them, polluting the air, and causing global heating as well as ocean acidification. We must demand that our governments immediately terminate these planet-destroying, future-killing fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you for listening.